When historians and researchers describe the year 1946 in Cologne, the narrative almost always focuses on the visible scars. They speak of the devastation above ground, the collapsed streets, the hollowed-out neighborhoods, and the broken bridges that dipped into the Rhine like severed limbs. The city was a landscape of jagged silhouettes, a place where the air tasted of pulverized brick and old smoke. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers and even today sits buried in the dense text of archival footnotes, did not begin in the ruins above. It began below the city, in the dark, quiet earth beneath its most famous landmark. It started with a simple, pragmatic reconstruction order. In the aftermath of the war, engineers were instructed to clear the massive piles of debris surrounding Cologne Cathedral. This structure was an architectural anomaly in itself. Despite enduring 14 heavy aerial hits, firestorms, and shock waves that leveled the rest of the city, the cathedral somehow remained standing. The goal of the excavation was strictly practical: stabilize the plaza, inspect the foundations, and determine whether the bruised giant needed reinforcement before the city could rebuild around it. The engineers were not looking for history. They were looking for safety. They needed to know if the ground could hold the weight of the future. But the moment the workers began removing the rubble and piercing the surface, the script changed. They broke through a layer that had not been exposed in centuries, and almost immediately, the atmosphere in the dig site shifted. Beneath the cathedral floor, deeper than medieval foundations were supposed to reach, the crews found walls and chambers that did not match the architectural plans held in the city archives. The first thing they noticed was the alignment. It was off subtly at first, then undeniably. The depth was unusual, far below where the Roman bedrock was assumed to be. But most unsettling was the stonework itself. It did not resemble the Gothic construction that towered above it, with its intricate but identifiable chisel marks. It did not even resemble Roman work as commonly understood, which usually consisted of smaller bricks and coarse mortar. This discovery was not mentioned in public reports. It did not make it into the reconstruction briefings broadcast to a weary public. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again, scribbled in the margins of daily logs: unforeseen structures. Unexpected depth. Older than anticipated. The workers, covered in the gray dust of a ruined era, found themselves standing on a floor that felt alien. They were prepared to find cracked Roman pottery or the charred remnants of earlier wooden structures. Instead, they found massive blocks. The official story would later simplify all of this into Roman, remains a convenient label that implies nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the photographs from the time tell a different story. Developed in dim basement darkrooms while Cologne was still smoldering, these images capture the confusion on the workers' faces. They show men standing beside stone blocks cut with a precision far cleaner than medieval chisels typically allow. These were blocks fitted together so tightly that even in the poor lighting of 1946 film grain, no mortar seams are visible. The photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim basement darkrooms while Cologne was still smoldering, show something different. They are grainy, high-contrast images that capture the stark reality of the excavation, free from the sanitizing edits of later official reports. They show workers, often weary men in flat caps and dust-covered jackets, standing beside stone blocks cut with precision far cleaner than medieval chisels typically allow. In standard medieval construction, stone cutting was an art of approximation. Gaps were expected, and mortar was the essential glue used to fill the voids and bind the uneven surfaces. But here, deep beneath the cathedral, the blocks were fitted together so tightly that even in the poor lighting of 1946 film grain, no mortar seams are visible. This specific detail, the absence of binding material, is profound. In the history of European architecture, the use of dry stone construction with such massive polygonal blocks is virtually unknown in this region. It is a technique usually reserved for the megalithic sites of Peru or Egypt, places where the masonry is interlocked through weight and friction, engineered to withstand seismic shifts that would crumble a rigid mortar wall. Yet here it was, in the soft soil of the Rhineland. The anomalies did not stop at the walls. The workers uncovered patterns carved into floors that do not resemble early Christian sites or Roman sites, but something older, more geometric, more deliberate. Early Christian iconography is distinct, is filled with symbols of faith, crude crosses, fish, and script. Roman floors are typically mosaics, intricate pictures made of tiny tesserae. But these floors were different. They were composed of large slabs arranged in mathematical grids, marked by lines that suggested a function rather than a decoration. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like history as we know it, and more like history that had been built over, buried, and forgotten. At first, the excavation team tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. They reached for the standard labels: old church foundations, earlier Roman settlement remains, or a natural accumulation of layers from centuries of habitation. It was a desperate attempt to force the impossible into the familiar. But as notes accumulated and more chambers were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the substructures built to support a weight far greater than the cathedral above them? The Gothic cathedral is a masterpiece of verticality, distributing weight through flying buttresses and relatively thin walls. The foundations found beneath, however, were massive, squat, and incredibly dense. They appeared designed to hold up something solid and colossal, a structure with a gravitational footprint far exceeding a hollow church nave. Why were certain stones shaped in near modular form, identical in dimension and curvature, as if manufactured rather than carved individually on site? And why did some corridors extend into darkness far beyond the footprint of the current cathedral? The excavation was supposed to be contained within the plaza, but the tunnels ignored the boundaries of the modern city above. The question that troubled even the most traditional archaeologists was not just about age, it was about scale. Were these deeper structures so massive because the builders lacked finesse, or because they were engineering for a cataclysm we can no longer imagine? Cologne Cathedral is enormous, a mountain of stone. Yet the foundational stonework beneath parts of it appeared built for something even larger, implying that the cathedral was merely a lightweight addition placed atop the ruins of a true giant. Researchers quietly admitted among themselves that the depth and scale did not line up with medieval records. And although none of them were using terms like lost civilizations in their official correspondence, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. The cathedral was not the first monumental building on that ground. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter. Descriptions became vague. Photographs stopped showing the widest angles of the chambers. When the excavation team moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the cathedral, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find Roman foundations, perhaps some medieval rebuilding, and scattered debris from centuries of renovations. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within days, that assumption collapsed because instead of a neat sequence of historical phases, the team uncovered a stack of architectural layers that did not behave the way layers of a normal city are supposed to behave. The first anomaly was alignment. In urban archaeology, cities are messy living organisms. They shift and rotate over time. A Roman street might run north-south, while a medieval alley built 500 years later twists to follow a new property line or a dried-up stream. Different architects, different cultures, different centuries, they do not build in perfect alignment with the people who live hundreds or even thousands of years apart. Yet in Cologne, they did. Vaults from one era sat directly above vaults from another. Corridors lined up with corridors buried meters below them. Load-bearing walls shared the same trajectory even when separated by centuries. It was as if every group that ever built on this site was copying an original blueprint, one that no longer existed in the historical record, but whose ghost dictated the geometry of everything that followed. As the workers dug deeper, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected Roman remains, they began encountering stonework that looked nothing like Roman engineering. Much larger blocks, much tighter joints, and patterns that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in Cologne's documented timeline. Some vaults appeared almost overbuilt arch chambers with flawless curvature, crafted with a precision that did not match the crude tools of the time. This was not just good masonry. It was impossible masonry. To achieve that level of geometric perfection in a subterranean support structure where no one would ever see it implies a completely different philosophy of building. Medieval builders were pragmatic. They did not waste resources on invisible perfection. But whoever built these deepest layers was operating under a different set of rules, where structural integrity and geometric harmony were paramount, regardless of visibility. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the archaeological team: water-worn foundations. Stone surfaces smooth as if shaped by running water, lower corridors with erosion marks, and floors with a sheen that only forms after prolonged saturation. Yet there is no historical record of Cologne Cathedral ever being submerged. No maps show ancient waterways beneath this specific point. Nothing explains why large sections of its deepest foundation look like they had once been underwater or buried beneath layers of wet sediment. It suggested a timeline that stretched back not just to an earlier civilization, but to a different geological era entirely. Photographs taken in 1946 show this clearly. Workers standing beside blocks so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Stones cut so precisely that even today's stonemasons study the images in disbelief. Angles and joins that resemble megalithic sites far older and far more advanced than anything medieval Europe is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what did not appear in the archives. The official reports written in the years after the excavation barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest chambers entirely. Certain layers of stonework are summarized with vague terms like foundation materials or earlier structures. Even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that, the silence is hard to miss. Because if these deeper layers truly belong to known historical periods, why were not they described in detail? Why were not the unusual construction techniques documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across archives instead of gathered into a single official report? Even some of the stone blocks raise a red flag. Edges too sharp, surfaces too smooth, grooves too uniform. They bore marks that looked less like hand tools and more like machinery that, according to the conventional timeline, did not exist when those stones were supposedly shaped. The deeper the team dug, the harder it became to fit these findings into the clean, linear narrative of Cologne's past. Because layer by layer, the ground beneath the cathedral began to look less like a sequence of eras and more like a stack of rewritten stories, a place built, rebuilt, and buried many times, yet always keeping the same mysterious geometric order. And this brings us to the most important turning point in the entire excavation. A discovery that did not fit any period. A structure that did not match Roman engineering, did not match medieval design, did not match any known civilization tied to Cologne. Something out of place, something out of time. The workers uncovered chambers and architectural features that historians still struggle to categorize. Structures that seem to belong to a world older than anything currently recognized. Among these were the giant circular stone sockets. Officially, they are labeled as ancient wells. But nothing about them fits typical Roman or medieval well design. These were too symmetrical, too deep, and too perfectly rounded, as if they were cut with tools capable of maintaining flawless curvature. Some sockets were wide enough to stand inside, others narrowed to a point, almost like the base for machinery or rotating structures. Workers from 1946 described them as engineered cavities, not wells, but forms with a mechanical purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been. Another anomaly appeared in the placement of certain columns. These were not simply resting on the floor below. Many were positioned at angles that made no architectural sense, tilted, offset, or sitting above blocks that clearly predated them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the metal embedded inside ancient stone. Some pieces looked fused, melted, or crystallized. Yet they were found in layers supposedly older than any metallurgy advanced enough to produce such effects. The official explanation was construction debris from later periods. But that does not explain why the metal appears inside the stones, not attached, not fastened, but fused like the stone was shaped around it. That kind of effect requires temperatures far beyond medieval kilns, far beyond Roman smelting, and far beyond anything recorded in local history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. The rhythm of the excavation shifted abruptly. Chambers were sealed again. Corridors were filled with concrete and rubble. Deep sections of the site were cut off from further exploration. Some of this was officially labeled as structural reinforcement, a necessary measure to stabilize the cathedral after the trauma of wartime damage. And to a degree, that was true. The cathedral was fragile. But the decisions about which chambers to seal first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers, questions that linger to this day. Because the rooms that were closed immediately were always the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The perfectly cut sockets, the angled columns, the strange metal inclusions, the engineered corridors that seemed to continue far beyond the excavation zone, these were the first to disappear. These corridors were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They were not random tunnels. They were part of an organized pattern, a grid of passages that looked less like storage and more like infrastructure. Aligned, measured, and planned, they appeared to connect to a much larger underground network, one that extended beneath the city long before Cologne Cathedral was ever designed. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances were blocked, their purpose unexplored. The deeper you read into the records, the more one detail becomes impossible to ignore. When you study the final weeks of a 1946 excavation, the project did not just end. It was stopped. The deeper Doppelfeld's team went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language became cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins. Because the last chambers they opened beneath Cologne Cathedral were not ordinary. They were not Roman. They were not medieval. They were not even identifiable. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described stonework that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Walls with joints so tight you could not fit a razor between them. Curved ceilings shaped with precision that medieval Europe was never supposed to have. Platforms built for loads far heavier than anything documented above them. And corridors that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing into darkness below modern Cologne. But here is the part that always gets buried. The most advanced chambers were the ones that were buried the fastest. Workers described filling entire rooms back in, sealing doors, packing earth into spaces that had just been uncovered. It was not gradual. It was immediate. The official explanation was always safety. But if it was only about safety, why were the oldest, cleanest, most structurally perfect chambers the ones sealed first? And why were the most fragile medieval layers left exposed for study? It does not make sense unless those deeper layers posed a different kind of threat, not a physical one, but a historical one. Imagine what it would mean if a Gothic cathedral was built on top of something far older, something massive, something engineered, something we did not build. Imagine what it means if the foundations were not medieval upgrades, but medieval attempts to hide or repurpose what came before. And maybe that is why the 1946 discoveries were quietly reburied. Not to protect the site, but to protect the narrative. Operation Unearthing Cologne Cathedral was not just an archaeological dig. It was a brief, accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about the old world. Because if this is what survived under one cathedral, imagine what still sleeps under the rest.